Chapter 1. Ashes of the World. The planet Quendra was once a thriving jewel of the galaxy, a place of towering cities, vibrant cultures, and a landscape so rich in life that it was often called the Garden of the Stars. All of that was before the collapse. The details of what happened were lost in the madness that followed, but one thing was certain. Something came from beyond the stars, and it brought ruin. The skies turned crimson, and the atmosphere burned as monstrous creatures, larger than the tallest buildings, began to crawl out from the world's darkest corners. These were not simple beasts. They were bioweapons engineered for war, bred for destruction, and set loose upon a defenseless world. The collapse was not just an invasion. It was an extermination. In the midst of this chaos, a young alien girl named Zeratis survived. Her once peaceful life was shattered in an instant. Her family was taken in the first waves of the invasion. Their city burned to nothing but smoldering ruins. The creatures, known as the Icarans, were merciless. They fed on life itself, consuming the very essence of living beings, leaving behind only desolate husks. Zeratis had always been different, though. Her people, the Kindari, were known for their grace and intellect, not for their strength or savagery. But something in Zeratis had always felt out of place, something fierce and primal. She discovered it on the night her city fell, when she had nothing left but her will to survive. She didn't know how she did it, but she fought back, killing an Icaran with nothing but her bare hands and a desperate surge of energy that flared from within her. Now, 2 years after the collapse, Zeratis was the last living Kindari on her planet. Alone, she wandered the desolate wastes, surviving day by day, scavenging for food, and avoiding the Icaran beasts that still roamed the shattered cities. The only companions she had were the haunting whispers of the dead and the ever-present growl of the monsters lurking in the shadows. Her survival had become second nature. She no longer hesitated when it came to fighting off a creature. Every day was a battle, and every breath she took was hard one. Still, Zeratis held on to hope, a flickering belief that somewhere out there in the vast galaxy, there were survivors. She wasn't entirely sure why she clung to this belief, but it was the only thing that kept her from succumbing to the endless despair that surrounded her. As she made her way through the ruins of what had once been a bustling city, now reduced to nothing but collapsed skyscrapers and crumbling streets, she heard something. A sound she hadn't heard in over a year. A voice. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her mind, but then she heard it again, faint but unmistakable. It was a human voice. Impossible. Quendra had never been a colony world for humans. Yet, there it was, cutting through the oppressive silence. Zeratis froze in place, her sharp violet eyes scanning the environment. The voice was coming from somewhere ahead, past the broken remnants of a collapsed building. Her heart raced, and against her better judgment, she decided to investigate. She moved swiftly but cautiously, using the debris for cover. The voice was growing clearer now, a man's voice. He was calling out for help. The sound was desperate, strained. She could sense the fear in his tone, but also a determination to survive. After navigating through the ruins, Zeratis spotted him. He was trapped beneath a large piece of rubble, struggling to free himself. He was human, and from the look of him, not in good shape. His clothes were torn and bloodied, and his left leg appeared to be crushed under the debris. Despite the pain etched across his face, he kept pushing at the rubble, trying to free himself. For a moment, Zeratis stood there, hidden in the shadows, unsure of what to do. Helping him could mean risking her life, but leaving him to die felt wrong. There was something about this man that sparked a long-dormant emotion within her, a need for connection, for hope. Taking a deep breath, Zeratis stepped out from her hiding place. "Hold still," she said in a quiet but firm voice. The man's eyes widened in shock as he saw her approach. He tried to speak, but only a strained gasp escaped his lips. He was too weak to protest. Zeratis moved quickly, assessing the rubble. It was heavy, but she had strength that far exceeded what most would expect from her slender form. With a deep grunt, she lifted the debris just enough for the man to drag his leg free. As soon as he was clear, she dropped the rubble with a loud crash. The man collapsed back against the ground, breathing heavily, his eyes filled with pain but also something else, relief. Zeratis knelt beside him, her eyes narrowing as she looked him over. He was in bad shape. If he didn't get help soon, he wouldn't last long. "Can you walk?" she asked. The man winced and shook his head. "I don't think so. My leg." Zarates looked down at his leg. It was badly mangled, and infection was already setting in. She bit her lip, thinking quickly. She could try to find shelter nearby, maybe a place to rest and figure out a way to treat his injuries. But staying out in the open was a death sentence. The Icarans were always on the hunt, and the noise from freeing him would have undoubtedly attracted them. "We need to move," Zarates said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If you stay here, you'll die." The man gave her a weak nod, his breath ragged. He looked at her with a mix of awe and disbelief, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "Who are you?" Zarates didn't answer immediately. Instead, she bent down and helped him to his feet, supporting his weight with ease despite his larger frame. "I'm your only chance of surviving this nightmare," she finally said. With the human leaning heavily on her, Zarates began to guide him through the ruins. Night was falling, and with it, the monsters would come. She had to get them both to safety before it was too late. Chapter 2. A Fragile Alliance. Zarates led the human man through the broken streets of the once great city, their progress slow and agonizing. The human, whose name she had yet to learn, struggled to keep pace, his injured leg dragging across the ground as he leaned heavily on her for support. Every step was a gamble, a risk of alerting the Icarans to their position. She could hear his labored breathing, his body worn from the ordeal of survival. It was clear to her that he had been running for a long time, evading the monstrous predators that now ruled this world. Despite his weakness, there was a certain resilience in his eyes, a will to survive that mirrored her own. "Where are you taking me?" he asked between ragged breaths. "There's a shelter not far from here," Zarates replied, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. "An old bunker. My people built it to withstand orbital bombardments. It's been my refuge, and now it will be yours too." The man nodded weakly, though he seemed uncertain. "You're not from around here, are you?" Zarates spared him a glance, but kept moving. "No, I'm Kindari." He squinted, trying to piece together the word. "Never heard of them." "You wouldn't have. Quindra was isolated before the collapse. Few visitors from other worlds." The conversation dwindled as they continued, the ruins stretching out endlessly before them. Zarates knew they were close, but she also knew time was running out. The Icarans would soon catch their scent, and there was no way to outrun them, especially with the human's injury. Finally, they reached what remained of an old maintenance hatch, partially hidden beneath layers of debris. Zarates knelt and began clearing the rubble away, revealing a rusted metal door. She glanced at the man, who was barely holding onto consciousness. "You still with me?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded faintly, though his eyes were half closed. She quickly activated the hidden access panel, and with a soft hiss, the door slid open to reveal a narrow set of stairs descending into the darkness. The bunker was more intact than she had expected. It wasn't large, but it was secure. "Come on," Zarates urged, helping him down the stairs. They were safe at least for now. Inside the bunker, Zarates laid the man down on a makeshift bed made from salvaged blankets. The small room was dimly lit by emergency lights, powered by an old generator she had scavenged and repaired over the years. There wasn't much in the way of supplies, but it was enough to survive. The man winced as she examined his leg. It was badly swollen, the skin turning a sickly shade of green. Zarates frowned, realizing it was worse than she thought. "We need to treat this infection," she muttered to herself. The man groaned, his hand weakly grabbing her arm. You saved me. Why?" Zarates hesitated for a moment. She didn't have an easy answer. In truth, she had acted on instinct, driven by a need to protect someone, anyone. Maybe it was the loneliness, the crushing isolation of being the last of her kind, that had pushed her to act. Maybe it was the faint hope that, if she could save him, she wasn't completely lost. "Because I had to," she said finally, standing up. "Now rest. I'll take care of the wound." As the man drifted into unconsciousness, Zarates set to work, using what little medical supplies she had left to clean and bind his injury. She could only hope it was enough to keep the infection at bay, at least for a little while. But the real danger lay outside the bunker walls. The Icarans never stopped hunting, and soon they would be on their trail again. Hours passed, and Zeratis sat by the entrance, listening intently for any signs of movement outside. The night was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that often erupted after dark. But she knew better than to let her guard down. The monsters were smart, patient hunters. They would come eventually. Just as she began to relax, a low, guttural growl echoed through the ruins above. Her heart skipped a beat. The Icarans had found them. Chapter 3. The Monsters at the Door. The low, guttural growls of the Icarans reverberated through the night air, echoing off the twisted wreckage of the once great city of Quindra. Zeratis stood by the reinforced door of the bunker, listening carefully to the sounds outside. She had spent months fortifying this place, making it as safe as she could, but now, with the Icarans so close, she knew even these walls wouldn't hold them for long. They were intelligent hunters, and once they caught the scent of living prey, they wouldn't stop until their quarry was dead. Cain lay on the makeshift bed behind her, his breathing labored, his face pale. The infection in his leg had spread rapidly, and though Zeratis had done everything she could to treat him with her limited supplies, it was clear he wouldn't survive much longer without proper medical care. His body was weakening by the hour, and the sounds outside suggested they didn't have much time left. Zeratis. Cain's voice was weak, barely a whisper. She turned to him, her eyes filled with concern. "I'm here," she said, moving closer to his side. "Try not to move too much. Your leg." "It's not the leg I'm worried about," Cain rasped, his eyes flicking toward the door. "Those things, they're out there, aren't they?" Zeratis nodded grimly. "They're close, but they haven't found us yet." Cain winced as he tried to sit up, pain etched across his face. "You need to leave. Get out of here while you can. Don't stay. Because of me." "I'm not leaving you," Zeratis said firmly. She had been alone for so long, fighting for her survival in this wasteland. And now that she had found someone else, she wasn't about to abandon him. "We can still make it out of this, but we have to act fast." Cain shook his head weakly. "You don't owe me anything. I'm just slowing you down." Zeratis placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but resolute. "I saved you for a reason, Cain, and I'm not giving up on you now. There's a way to get out of this, but I need you to trust me." He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "What's the plan?" Zeratis stood and walked to the door, her eyes narrowing as she listened to the Icarans moving outside. Their growls were growing louder, more frequent. They were closing in. "I'm going to lure them away," she said, her tone calm despite the tension in her body. "If I can get them to follow me, you'll be safe here. They're attracted to movement and sound. Once I'm gone, they'll lose interest in the bunker." Cain blinked in confusion. "You're going out there? Alone? That's suicide." "It's the only way," Zeratis replied, grabbing a small sound grenade from her belt. "I've survived out there for 2 years. I know how to avoid them. You can't move fast enough with that leg, but I can." Cain tried to sit up again, his hand reaching for her arm. "You can't do this. You'll never make it." "I will," Zeratis said, her voice firm. She knelt beside him, her violet eyes locking onto his. "I've done this before. I know what I'm doing." Cain stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. He didn't want her to go, but he knew she was right. There was no other way. "Just promise me you'll come back." Zeratis smiled softly, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "I promise." She stood up and strapped her blaster to her side, then activated the sound grenade. The small device emitted a soft whine as it powered up. Zeratis glanced at Cain one last time. "Stay quiet. Don't move unless you have to. I'll come back for you." With that, she opened the door just wide enough to slip outside, then closed it behind her. The night air was cool and heavy with the scent of decay. The city of Quindra, once a bustling metropolis, was now little more than a graveyard of crumbling buildings and twisted metal. Fires still smoldered in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. Zeratis moved swiftly and silently through the debris, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the Icarans. The monsters were near, but they hadn't spotted her yet. Ahead, she could see their dark forms prowling through the ruins. 3 of them, their long limbs moving with terrifying grace, their glowing red eyes scanning the area for movement. They were massive creatures, easily twice the size of a human, their black, chitinous skin glistening in the faint light. The Icarans were engineered for destruction, bioweapons unleashed upon her planet to wipe out all life. And they had done their job well. Zerades crouched behind a pile of rubble, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the creatures. She had to be smart about this. One wrong move, and they would be on her in seconds. She couldn't fight them directly, not without backup. But she didn't need to fight them. She just needed to lead them away. Taking a deep breath, Zerades reached for the sound grenade at her belt. The device was small but powerful, designed to emit a high-pitched screech that mimicked the cry of a wounded animal, something the Icarans couldn't resist. She activated it, then threw it as far as she could, watching as it sailed through the air and landed several blocks away. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the grenade detonated, emitting a piercing wail that echoed through the empty streets. The sound cut through the night like a blade, drawing the attention of the Icarans instantly. The monsters' heads snapped in the direction of the noise, their glowing eyes narrowing as they zeroed in on the source. With a deafening roar, they charged toward it, their powerful limbs propelling them forward with terrifying speed. Zerades watched them go, her pulse racing. The plan was working, but she wasn't safe yet. As soon as the Icarans were out of sight, Zerades turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, her movements quick and silent. She needed to put as much distance between herself and the bunker as possible before the Icarans realized the ruse. Kane was still inside, and if the creatures doubled back, they would tear through the bunker's defenses with ease. Her feet pounded against the cracked pavement as she weaved through the ruins, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The city was a maze of destruction, with collapsed buildings and twisted metal blocking her path at every turn. But Zerades had navigated these streets for years now, and she knew every shortcut, every hidden passage that could give her an advantage. As she rounded a corner, she spotted an old transport vehicle half buried under a collapsed building. It was rusted and damaged, but if she could get it running, it might be fast enough to lead the Icarans farther away from the bunker. Zerades rushed to the vehicle, her hands shaking as she inspected the controls. It was an older model, one she wasn't entirely familiar with, but the basic principles were the same. She quickly hotwired the engine, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The engine sputtered to life with a loud roar, and Zerades' heart sank. The noise would attract the Icarans for sure, but she had no choice now. She needed to move. She gunned the throttle, and the transport lurched forward, speeding through the streets with a screech of metal. In the distance, she heard the telltale growls of the Icarans. They had realized the deception, and they were coming for her. Zerades pushed the vehicle to its limits, the landscape blurring around her as she sped through the ruins. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, dark, hulking shapes racing after her, their glowing red eyes locked onto the transport. They were gaining on her. Zerades' heart pounded as she swerved the vehicle through the narrow streets, her hands gripping the controls tightly. The Icarans were fast, faster than she had anticipated, and they were closing the gap with every passing second. She needed to lose them, and she needed to do it fast. Up ahead, she spotted a collapsed building blocking the road. Her mind raced as she formulated a plan. If she could get the Icarans to follow her into the debris, she might be able to trap them. It was risky, but it was her only chance. She steered the transport toward the pile of rubble, then slammed on the brakes just before reaching it. The vehicle skidded to a halt, and Zerades leapt out, sprinting toward the nearest alley. Behind her, the Icarans barreled into the debris, their massive bodies crashing through the wreckage with a deafening roar. Zerades didn't look back. She kept running, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she ducked into the alley and disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of the Icarans tearing through the rubble reached her ears. They had taken the bait. Icarans. Zerades allowed herself a brief moment to catch her breath, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion. The Icarans were powerful, but they weren't particularly intelligent. She had lured them into the debris, buying herself time and creating enough distance between herself and the bunker to keep Kane safe, for now. But this wasn't over yet. The night was still thick with tension, and Zerades knew the Icarans wouldn't stay distracted for long. They would tear through the rubble soon enough and come searching for her. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not when Kane's life and her own depended on it. She wiped the sweat from her brow and scanned her surroundings. The alley she had ducked into was narrow and filled with piles of discarded metal and broken machinery, remnants of the once thriving industrial sector of Quendra. It offered decent cover, but she couldn't stay here. If she lingered, the Icarans would track her scent. She needed to move. Carefully, Zeratis peered around the corner of the alley, her sharp eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. The Icarans were still thrashing in the distance, their massive forms barely visible through the haze of dust and smoke. She had a window of opportunity, but it was shrinking by the second. She had to think fast. A few blocks away, she remembered a network of underground tunnels that had once been used for public transport. They had been largely abandoned after the collapse, but if she could reach them, they would provide her with a way to escape the immediate area and circle back to the bunker without being seen. The tunnels were dangerous, dark, and unstable, but they were her best option. Zeratis took one last glance at the Icarans in the distance, then made her move. She darted out of the alley, her movements swift and precise. Her boots made barely a sound as she navigated the cracked pavement and debris-strewn streets. The city around her was eerily silent, save for the distant growls of the Icarans. Every corner she turned, every shadow she passed, felt like a potential ambush. But Zeratis had learned long ago how to stay calm under pressure. Her survival depended on it. As she neared the entrance to the underground tunnels, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The Icarans were on the move again, having torn through the pile of rubble she had used to slow them down. Their roars echoed through the night, a haunting reminder of the danger that lurked just behind her. Zeratis reached the entrance to the tunnels, a large, rusted grate that had once served as a ventilation shaft. She quickly pried it open, the metal screeching as she forced it aside. Without wasting another second, she slipped inside, lowering herself into the darkness below. The tunnel was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space, and the only light came from the dim glow of her wrist-mounted device, which cast a pale blue hue over the walls. Zeratis took a deep breath and began to move through the tunnel, her steps careful and measured. The tunnel network was vast, stretching for miles beneath the city, and Zeratis knew it would be easy to get lost if she wasn't careful. But she had spent enough time navigating the ruins of Quendra to have memorized most of the layout. She just needed to follow the main path until she found a way to surface closer to the bunker. As she moved deeper into the tunnel, the sound of the Icarans above grew fainter, replaced by the low hum of machinery that had long since fallen into disrepair. Zeratis allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The plan was working. She had successfully drawn the Icarans away from the bunker, and now, with them distracted, she could circle back to Kane without being followed. But something about the tunnel felt off. Zeratis paused, her senses on high alert. The air felt different, heavier, as if something was lurking just beyond the edges of the light. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement, but the tunnel was deathly silent. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement in the darkness. Zeratis spun around, her blaster drawn, the blue light from her wrist illuminating the shadows. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty tunnel stretching out before her. But then, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of something skittering along the walls. Her pulse quickened. She had heard stories about the creatures that lived in the tunnels beneath Quendra, mutated by whatever had caused the collapse of her planet. No one had ever seen them up close and lived to tell the tale, but the rumors were enough to make her blood run cold. The Icarans were bad enough, but these were something else entirely. Zeratis took a cautious step back, her eyes darting around the tunnel. The skittering sound was getting louder now, echoing off the walls in all directions. Whatever was down here with her, it wasn't alone. She needed to move. Fast. Turning on her heel, Zeratis broke into a run, her footsteps echoing through the tunnel as she raced deeper into the darkness. The skittering sounds followed her, growing louder and more frantic with every passing second. She could hear them now, the creatures moving through the walls, their sharp claws scraping against the stone. Up ahead, she spotted a service ladder leading back to the surface. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the creatures closing in behind her, their presence like a shadow at her back. Zeratis reached the ladder and leapt onto it, climbing as fast as she could. The metal rungs were slick with moisture, but she gripped them tightly, refusing to let go. Below her, the skittering sounds grew louder, more frantic, as the creatures swarmed beneath her. She climbed faster, her muscles burning with the effort. The top of the ladder was just within reach, the surface only a few feet away. She could make it. She had to. With one final burst of energy, Zeratis pulled herself up and out of the tunnel, rolling onto the cracked pavement above. She scrambled to her feet, her blaster at the ready. But when she looked down, the creatures had already retreated back into the darkness, their skittering sounds fading into silence. Zeratis took a deep breath, her heart still racing. She had escaped the tunnels, but she wasn't safe yet. The Icarans were still out there, somewhere, and she needed to get back to Kane before it was too late. She turned and began making her way back toward the bunker, her mind focused on the task at hand. The night was still dangerous, and the monsters were still hunting, but Zeratis had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. Chapter 4. A Light in the Darkness. Zeratis leaned heavily against the cold metal of the bunker door, her muscles aching from the night's ordeal. Every breath she took felt ragged, her body sore and exhausted from the chase. But she had made it back, somehow, after all the close encounters with the Icarans and the unknown horrors lurking in the tunnels. Her heart still pounded with the remnants of adrenaline, but the immediate danger had passed. The bunker was silent, the soft hum of the old generator the only sound in the small space. The flickering emergency lights cast long shadows on the concrete walls, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The space, which had always felt like a fortress of safety for her, now felt small and stifling. Kane lay on the makeshift bed, exactly where she had left him. His face, pale and drawn, was turned toward the dim light, and his chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. The infection in his leg had worsened considerably, spreading up his thigh in dark, angry lines that pulsed with fever. Zeratis' heart tightened at the sight of him. She had done everything she could, but it hadn't been enough. He was slipping away. "Kane," she whispered, moving closer to his side, her voice soft and hesitant. She reached out and touched his arm gently, feeling the heat radiating from his fevered skin. "Kane, I'm back." His eyelids fluttered, his breathing faltering for a moment before resuming its strained rhythm. After a few tense seconds, his eyes slowly opened, though they remained unfocused at first. When they finally settled on her, a weak smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "You came back," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Zeratis nodded, her throat tight. "I told you I would." He blinked slowly, his brow furrowing in confusion as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Thought you wouldn't make it," he murmured, his words slurred by the fever. "Those things, they were everywhere." "I made it," she said, her voice firm but soft. "You're safe now." Kane tried to sit up, but the effort sent a grimace of pain across his face. He collapsed back onto the bed with a shaky breath, his eyes squeezed shut against the agony in his leg. Zeratis reached out and gently placed her hand on his chest, urging him to stay still. "Don't move," she said softly. "You need to rest." He gave a weak nod, though his eyes remained shut. After a moment, his breathing began to even out again, though it was still labored. Zeratis could see how much pain he was in, the infection in his leg now consuming more of his body than she had initially realized. It was spreading rapidly, and without proper medical treatment, there was nothing more she could do. "How bad is it?" Kane asked suddenly, his voice barely audible. His eyes opened again, and this time they were clearer, more focused, though there was an undeniable weariness in them. "Tell me the truth." Zeratis hesitated, her gaze falling to his leg. The skin around the wound had turned a sickly shade of green, the infection creeping up toward his torso. It was clear that he didn't have much time left. She swallowed hard, the truth weighing heavily on her heart. "It's bad," she admitted quietly. "The infection is spreading. I've done everything I can, but—" Kane closed his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. He seemed to absorb the gravity of her words in silence, his chest rising and falling as he processed the reality of his situation. Zeratis wanted to offer him some kind of comfort, but she didn't know what to say. She had always been a survivor, but this was different. This was something she couldn't fight, something she couldn't control. "Thank you," Kane said softly, his voice hoarse. His eyes opened again, meeting hers with a look of gratitude. "For everything." Zarati shook her head, her chest tight. "Don't thank me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't save you. I should have been faster. Should have found more supplies." "You saved me," Kane interrupted, his voice firmer despite the pain. "You saved my life when I was already as good as dead. You didn't have to, but you did. You gave me a chance." Zaratis looked down, blinking back the tears that threatened to well up in her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. She had learned long ago that tears didn't save anyone, they didn't change the brutal reality of survival. But now, with Kane lying before her, slipping away, she felt the overwhelming weight of her helplessness. "I should have done more," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kane gave her a weak smile, his hand reaching out to touch hers. "You did enough," he said softly. "More than enough." Zaratis squeezed his hand gently, feeling the warmth of his fevered skin beneath her fingers. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the soft hum of the generator and the distant growls of the Icarans outside the bunker. She knew they didn't have much time before the monsters returned, but right now, she didn't care. All that mattered was this moment. "Kane," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want to be alone again." Kane's smile faded, his eyes filled with understanding. He squeezed her hand weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "You won't be." Tears welled up in Zaratis' eyes, and this time, she didn't try to stop them. She let them fall silently, her shoulders shaking as she cried. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the pain of loss, the weight of all the lives she had seen taken by the horrors of this world. And now, she was losing Kane to someone who, in such a short time, had become a beacon of hope in her shattered life. Kane's breathing grew shallower, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Zaratis could feel his grip on her hand weakening, his life slipping away with each passing moment. She held on to him, unwilling to let go, but she knew it was inevitable. "Zaratis." Kane's voice was barely audible now, his eyes half closed. "You're stronger than you think. Don't give up." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I won't," she whispered. Kane gave her one last, faint smile before his eyes fluttered shut, his body going still. His chest rose one final time, then stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Zaratis sat there for a long time, holding his hand long after his warmth had faded. The world outside seemed distant, the sounds of the Icarans moving through the ruins nothing more than an afterthought. All that remained was the crushing weight of her loss. After what felt like hours, Zaratis finally stood, her legs shaky but steady. She looked down at Kane, her heart heavy with grief, but also with a sense of resolve. He had been right, she was stronger than she thought, and she couldn't let this world break her. Not now, not after everything. She gently placed her hand on Kane's forehead, closing his eyes with a soft touch. "Goodbye, Kane," she whispered. The bunker felt colder now, emptier. But Zaratis knew what she had to do. She gathered her belongings, strapping her blaster to her side, and preparing to face the world outside once more. The Icarans were still out there, and the dangers of this planet hadn't lessened. But she had a purpose now, a reason to keep fighting. She opened the door to the bunker and stepped out into the cold morning air. The city lay in ruins before her, the sky above streaked with the first light of dawn. Zaratis took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, and set her gaze on the horizon. She was alone again, but she would survive. She would keep fighting. For Kane, for herself, and for whatever future lay ahead in the desolate world she called home.